For 60 years, the world was told a story about a devoted Catholic wife, 11 children, a sprawling green estate in Virginia, and a marriage so solid it became the emotional counterweight to the glamour of Camelot. While Jack and Jackie Kennedy dazzled the world with style, Bobby and Ethel Kennedy were sold as something steadier, a warm, chaotic, football-in-yard kind of love. But peel back the touch football games, the horses, the 9-child brood at Hickory Hill, and you find a marriage built on more turbulence, more silence, and more heartbreak than the Kennedy myth machine ever wanted the public to see. This is the real story of Ethel and Robert Kennedy, a marriage forged in tragedy, tested by rumor, and ultimately frozen forever by an assassin's bullet. Part 1. The Skakels, richer, wilder, and harder to control. To understand Ethel Kennedy, you first have to understand where she came from, and it wasn't the Kennedys. Ethel Skakel was born in 1928 in Chicago, the daughter of George Skakel, a self-made coal-mining magnate, and his devout Catholic wife, Anne. The Skakels were, in a very specific sense, more than the Kennedys wealthier, according to some accounts, and considerably less disciplined. Where Joseph Kennedy Sr. ran his family like a machine built for public office, the Skakel household was famous for its recklessness, fast cars, hard drinking, and a general disregard for consequences that would later reappear, tragically, in a different generation of the family. Ethel grew up riding horses, sailing, and attending a string of Sacred Heart Catholic schools before landing at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York. It was there she became roommates with a young woman named Jean Kennedy, the sister of a war hero named Joseph Kennedy Jr., who had died in a wartime plane crash in 1944, and of 2 younger brothers named John and Robert. In 1945, Jean brought Ethel along on a skiing trip to Quebec and introduced her to her brother Robert. There was just one complication. At the time, Robert Kennedy was dating Ethel's own older sister, Patricia. It wasn't until that relationship ended that Robert and Ethel began seeing each other. It's a small detail the Kennedy mythology tends to skip past. The marriage that would come to define wholesome Kennedy domesticity began, in part, inside a sister's broken relationship. They got engaged in February 1950 and married 4 months later, on June 17, 1950, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich, Connecticut. Ethel graduated from college with a degree in English the year before, and by 1951 she was already a mother. She would go on to have 11 children over the next 17 years, a pace of childbirth that was, even by the standards of a large Catholic family, extraordinary. Part 2. Hickory Hill, Camelot's rowdier cousin. The Kennedys settled into Hickory Hill, a grand estate in McLean, Virginia, that had once briefly belonged to Jack and Jackie before Bobby and Ethel took it over. It became the stage for the image the public came to associate with Ethel. A boisterous hostess presiding over parties with guest lists running into the hundreds, where cabinet secretaries in suits were liable to end up thrown, fully clothed, into the swimming pool, and where a friendly game of touch football might end with someone's dinner jacket in ruins. By outward appearance, it was the picture of a thriving marriage, dogs, horses, children underfoot, a wife who seemed entirely devoted to her husband's political rise. Biographer Arthur Schlesinger Jr., in his landmark book on Robert Kennedy, wrote that Robert, a man who was, by most accounts, shy, moody, and given to bouts of pessimism, found in his marriage the emotional ballast he needed. Ethel, in Schlesinger's telling, drew out his sense of humor and his sympathy in a way few others could, and did it without ever requiring him to perform or prove himself to her. That is the sanctioned version of events, the one that ran in the magazines and the campaign by Boppus. It is not, however, the whole story. Part 3. The rumors that wouldn't go away. Robert Kennedy's public image was that of the most upright of the Kennedy brothers, puritanical, in the words of biographer Larry Tye, who spent years researching Kennedy's life for his book on Robert's political and personal history. Tye's assessment was blunt. Robert was, by Kennedy family standards, the most sanctimonious and least likely of the brothers to stray. And yet the rumors persisted for decades. Tye interviewed people close to the family and came away convinced that Robert had, at minimum, flirted the way other Kennedy men did, and that outright infidelity was plausible, even if it could never be definitively proven. Tye's ultimate, carefully hedged conclusion was that Robert most likely did have affairs, while still insisting that Ethel remained, in some fundamental sense, the one great love of his life, a formula that manages to hold two contradictory ideas about the marriage at once. The most persistent and most publicly damaging rumor involved not a stranger, but Robert's own sister Nella, Jacqueline Kennedy. After President Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Robert Kennedy became one of the only people Jackie could lean on. He helped manage the funeral logistics, comforted her in the immediate aftermath, and remained close to her for years afterward, closer, by some accounts, than he was to his own wife during that period. Biographer J. Randy Taraborrelli has written that Robert found little comfort at home in the wake of his brother's murder, and instead gravitated toward Jackie. The two were photographed together on vacations, sometimes holding hands, fueling years of tabloid speculation about the true nature of their bond. Ethel, according to Taraborrelli's reporting, found the rumors troubling, not necessarily because she believed them, but because of what they signaled about her marriage and her already complicated relationship with her sister-in-law. The two women were said to have never been especially close, tolerating each other largely because their husbands were brothers. Taraborrelli documents a string of tense encounters between them, including one occasion on which Ethel reportedly referred to Jackie, dismissively, as unchanged and self-absorbed. Even so, Jackie's brother Jamie Auchinclose has said that Ethel was direct with Jackie about the gossip swirling around them, warning her plainly that people were talking about the two of them behind their backs. Whatever the truth of the Robert and Jackie rumors, and most historians treat them as unlikely, given how tightly bound Robert was to his own enormous family, the fact that they persisted at all tells you something about how fragile the perfect marriage narrative actually was, even while Robert was alive. Part 4. A family built on loss before it was ever built on scandal. It's worth pausing here to note that Ethel's marriage to Robert was never insulated from catastrophe. It was shaped by it from the very beginning. Robert's own eldest brother, Joseph Kennedy Jr., had died in a wartime plane crash years before Robert and Ethel even met. Then, in October 1955, just 5 years into their marriage, Ethel's own parents, George and Ann Skakel, were killed together when their private plane went down near Union City, Oklahoma. That kind of sudden, violent loss would come to define the rhythm of Ethel's entire adult life. She would lose her father-in-law's dynastic dreams to assassination once, in 1963, when her brother-in-law Jack was murdered in Dallas, and she would lose her own husband to an assassin's bullet 5 years after that, in June 1968, while she was standing barely feet away from him, several months pregnant with their 11th child. The marriage, in other words, was never conducted in peacetime. It existed inside a family that seemed to generate tragedy the way other families generate holiday traditions, and that backdrop of relentless loss is part of what makes the private tensions of the marriage so much harder to untangle from simple grief and trauma. Part 5. The night everything ended. By 1968, Robert Kennedy was running for president, campaigning alongside Ethel in city after city, trying to finish the political project his brother had left unfinished. On June 5, 1968, moments after declaring victory in the California primary, he was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Ethel, pregnant with the couple's 11th child, rushed to his side as he lay dying on the kitchen floor. He died the next day. Their last child, a daughter named Rory, was born 6 months later, in December 1968, a child who would never meet her father. Ethel was 40 years old. She had been married for 18 years, and she would spend the next 56 years of her life as his widow, never remarrying. Part 6. Life after Bobby, and the rumors that followed her instead. Widowhood didn't end the speculation about Ethel's private life, it simply redirected it. In the years after Robert's death, Ethel developed a close, long-running friendship with the singer Andy Williams, who began escorting her to public events. Given that Williams' own marriage was, at the time, widely reported to be troubled, the press did what the press does. It assumed an affair. Williams and his wife eventually divorced, and he went on to remarry someone else. But he and Ethel always maintained, publicly and consistently, that their bond had never been anything other than platonic. Ethel herself was unambiguous about why she would never remarry. Speaking to People magazine in 1991, more than 2 decades after Robert's death, she said flatly that remarrying would amount to a kind of infidelity to a man who, in her mind, was still watching over her. She asked, rhetorically, how she could possibly do such a thing with Bobby looking down from heaven. It's a line that captures something real about how she understood her own marriage in retrospect. not as the complicated, rumor-shadowed partnership biographers would later dissect, but as a singular, unrepeatable bond that death itself hadn't dissolved. She went on to build an entire second act out of that loyalty, founding the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights just months after his assassination, an organization that carries his name and his causes to this day. She raised 11 children largely on her own, co-chaired gun control coalitions, and remained a fixture at Hickory Hill for decades, hosting the same kind of sprawling, chaotic gatherings that had defined the marriage in its prime. Part 7. The Next Generation's Scandals, and Why They Matter to Ethel's Story. Part of what makes revisiting Ethel and Robert's marriage so unsettling today is watching how the patterns repeated in the following generation. Their sixth child, Michael Kennedy, was revealed in 1997 to have been involved in a years-long relationship with the family's babysitter, one that reportedly began when the girl was only 14 years old. The story broke publicly just as his own marriage was collapsing. Another son, Joseph Kennedy too, caused a car accident on Nantucket that left a young woman permanently paralyzed. A nephew by marriage, William Kennedy Smith, stood trial on a rape allegation and was ultimately acquitted, in a case that also drew in Ethel's brother-in-law, Senator Ted Kennedy. One of Ethel's own children, Christopher Kennedy, would later address this pattern head-on rather than deflect from it, acknowledging publicly that the family could no longer simply blame alcoholism for behavior that had, by then, become too consistent to ignore. And the echoes didn't stop there. Decades later, Ethel's son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., would find himself at the center of his own headline-making infidelity scandal, reported affairs that strained his marriage to actress Cheryl Hines, playing out publicly in the same tabloid ecosystem that had once speculated about his own parents' marriage. When Ethel died in October 2024, at the age of 96, Hines paused her own very public marital troubles to publicly mourn her mother-in-law, remembering warm nights at Hyannisport and a woman who, in her words, dressed elegantly even while going barefoot. Part 8. What the nasty marriage really was. So was Ethel Kennedy's marriage nasty. Not in the sense of open warfare, screaming matches, or a public unraveling. What emerges instead, from decades of biographies and reporting, is something more complicated. A marriage that projected total devotion to the outside world, while privately absorbing infidelity rumors, siblings-adjacent scandal, relentless external tragedy, and according to biographers like Larry Tye, very likely some real infidelity on Robert's part, all while Ethel apparently chose, again and again, to keep the family machine running rather than let any of it show. She was, by nearly every account, aware of at least some of what swirled around her marriage, and she made a decision, one she stood by for the rest of her life, to protect the version of the story that mattered most to her: 11 children, a shared cause, and a husband she would spend 56 years refusing to replace, even in memory. That's arguably the nastiest part of the whole story, not a single scandal or a single betrayal, but the sheer amount of private turbulence one woman absorbed in order to maintain, for the public and perhaps for herself, the myth of the perfect Kennedy marriage. Outro. Ethel Kennedy died on October 10, 2024, after suffering a stroke, at the age of 96. She left behind 9 surviving children, dozens of grandchildren, and a legacy stretched across 6 decades of American public life, most of it built on the foundation of a marriage that lasted 18 years but that she spent the rest of her life quietly, fiercely defending. Whatever really happened inside that marriage, the rumors, the tension with Jackie, the affairs biographers believe were real, Ethel Kennedy made sure the world remembered her as Bobby's widow, not his victim. And in the end, that might be the most Kennedy thing about the entire story, not the scandal itself, but the discipline it took to outlast it.